Welcome to this explainer. We're jumping right into an absolutely fascinating and honestly kind of tragic paradox today. We're unpacking a concept from writer Nick Sasaki. It's this brilliant imaginary conversation he crafted between some of history's greatest spiritual figures. Think about it. For thousands of years, we've had no shortage of religion, right? We've got scriptures, prayers, rich traditions, the whole shebang. Yet somehow, our world is literally bleeding from division and conflict. And here's the kicker. It's often justified using the exact same sacred words that were meant to bring us together. It's a massive contradiction. How in the world do we reconcile the divine with how deeply divided we actually are?
Okay, let's dive into this. Consider this really profound question. It's the hook for everything we're exploring today. Sasaki sets up this round table with folks like Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Confucius, and Rumi. But they aren't debating religious doctrine. No, they're asking a way deeper question about human connection. If the core premise of so many faiths is that God is the parent of all humanity, well, what happens to the whole idea of an enemy? If every single person is a child of God, then absolutely no one is outside the family. No one. That person you fear or fight, they aren't the other. Fundamentally, they're your sibling.
Section 1. The paradox of faith. Beliefs versus actions.
Now, what's really interesting here is the massive gap between speaking holy words and actually living them out. On one hand, you've got knowing God's name, performing rituals, saying the right things. But often, actually, it almost always comes with pride and division when it's just on the surface. Like Confucius points out in the text, ritual without sincerity, it just becomes an empty performance. But then, contrast that with knowing God's heart. This is where compassion actually becomes action. It's where belief softens your heart instead of hardening it. Jesus, Buddha, Confucius, they all hit the nail on the head with this exact distinction. You could literally memorize every holy text on the planet, but if your mind is still ruled by fear and anger, you're completely missing the point. True faith isn't about claiming a divine name for your own tribe. It's about reflecting divine love out into the real world.
The 13th century poet Rumi puts this so beautifully. A name can sit on the tongue, God's heart must burn in the soul. I mean, wow. He's really warning us about the ego here. He's saying that religion actually becomes dangerous when our ego tries to claim ownership over the divine. When we use a sacred name with pride, it just divides us. Your tongue can easily say a word, sure, but if your heart hasn't actually transformed, that word is completely empty.
And right alongside Rumi, we get this profound alignment from Jesus. God's heart is known when compassion becomes action. What Sasaki is doing here is creating this sort of chorus of the sages. Even though they span entirely different eras, cultures, and geographies, these historical figures are all pointing to the exact same foundational truth. You don't prove you know God by how loud you pray. You prove it by how you treat the most vulnerable person standing right in front of you. Compassion absolutely has to be an action verb.
Section 2. The universal human dream. Longing for unity.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it, but humanity keeps repeating the exact same dream of peace, just, in different languages. Our ancient scriptures are absolutely packed with calls for love and justice. But even if you fast forward to the modern era, what are we doing? We're belting out pop songs like John Lennon's Imagine or We Are the World. And these aren't just catchy tunes. They represent a deeply rooted memory. Sasaki's dialogue suggests that peace is actually our original home. Our soul remembers where it belongs. So when we sing about unity, it's not just some naive wishing. It's an ache. It's this deep recognition that a family just isn't complete when its members are endlessly fighting. We are basically homesick for a world we haven't quite built yet.
Section 3. Unmasking the Holy War. A deep contradiction.
Let's see how this builds, step by deadly step. This is essentially Buddha's deconstruction of how faith gets twisted into violence. First up, you have fear. Fear creates this illusion that we're somehow separate from one another. Then, pride steps in to protect that illusion. We start thinking, oh, we are definitely better than them. And finally, group identity gives that pride a uniform. It gives it a flag. And suddenly, cruelty toward the other isn't seen as a sin anymore. It's actually praised as loyalty. We just slap a holy label on human rage, and the tragedy is complete.
Just let this quote from Rumi really sink in for a second. The ego loves uniforms. It says, my people, my truth, my God. Love says there is no stranger in the house of the beloved. Holy war is literally the ultimate spiritual contradiction. Why? Because the tongue is saying God, but the underlying heart is just screaming me.
It's all about possession and dominance. But true love, like true spiritual sight, recognizes that there are no strangers. None. Everyone belongs to the exact same house.
Section 4. When enemies become family. Reframing conflict.
And here is the core paradigm shift. We are completely redefining the word enemy. Now, we're not saying evil doesn't exist. Obviously, people do terrible things. But we're talking about changing our spiritual sight. Instead of seeing an outsider who just deserves to be destroyed, you see a wounded brother or sister who lost their way, but is still a child of God. The moment you do that, hatred loses its false permission. You strip away the moral cover for vengeance because you absolutely refuse to forget who that other person is before their creator.
Now, you might be wondering, okay, but what about justice? Well, let's look at the two views here. On one hand, you have justice as punishment. This is driven by human rage, it indulges in hatred, and honestly, it just multiplies suffering. But on the other hand, guided by the wisdom of figures like Moses and Confucius, we see justice as restoration. You absolutely still name the wrongdoing clearly. People are held accountable for sure, but it's done without dehumanizing them. It's about moral repair that honors our human bonds. You correct the wrong, absolutely, but you don't throw away the human being.
So let's pause and be incredibly honest with ourselves for a second. Asking ourselves to look at someone who wronged us or someone from a nation we're literally told to hate and see them as family, that is unbelievably hard. What kind of courage does that take? It takes the courage to release the story of separation we've been fed our entire lives, a really disciplined courage to not let your grief turn into hatred. So how do we actually move this from some lofty philosophical theory into demanding, messy, everyday reality?
Section 5. Practicing peace every day. Daily habits.
So the crucial point is that translating peace into reality is a daily practice, not just a wish. Drawing from these sages, here's a highly practical roadmap. Step 1. Pause before your anger becomes speech. Really try to notice the pain beneath your judgment. Step 2. Practice daily courtesy, gratitude, and restraint. Peace is built through repeated everyday conduct, a gentle word, keeping a promise. And step 3. Forgive and serve the person directly in front of you. Love isn't some grand abstract theory. It only becomes real when it physically touches the person right in front of you.
Now, imagine if we took those personal habits and scaled them up to the global stage. What would leadership actually look like if politicians viewed every nation's citizens as their own siblings? Well, they'd rule by virtue before force. They would protect their own people, of course, but they'd do it without despising others. A true leader would have a heart way wider than their country's border, knowing that every single flag covers mothers, fathers, and children. They would literally never speak of enemies lightly.
If you take away just one thing from this entire explainer, let it be this incredibly powerful thought from Nick Sasaki. Treat the person in front of you as family. Not just when they agree with you, not just when they're easy to love, but especially when they're different or mistaken or angry or afraid. That is exactly where the dream of unity finally leaves the songbook and becomes a reality.
I want to leave you with this final provocative question. Think about the person in front of you today, the barista, that frustrating coworker, maybe a stranger in traffic. If you truly see them as belonging to God, as your actual sibling, how's that going to change the way you treat them today? Because world peace doesn't start with some giant global treaty. It starts with your very next interaction. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this challenges you to see your world just a little bit differently today.